Soft, Wang. Ah, yes.
Hi, it is pronounced Crichton, and this is a review for the reboot Shadow Warrior series, namely Shadow Warrior 2013 and its 2016 sequel, Shadow Warrior 2. And I've been trying to come up with an opening joke for so long that I actually forgot what my current objective was. Well, that's in bad taste. Then again, Shadow Warrior is not a game about being in good taste. It is a game about slaughter, ballistic carnage, and modular dismemberment, in which case the ethics of taste fall on good, bad, I'm the guy with the gun. And ignoring moral relativism in the Second Amendment, Flying Wildhawk had posited a much less abstract hypothesis. What if the guy with the gun also gets a sword? And the answer is a first-person hack-and-slash reboot of a classical shooter which is not only quality fun gameplay, but it also served to set some of the postulates for how products of this kind ought to be designed in order to work in the modern era. We will discuss that in the gameplay section. And another important role, this one related to reception more so than mechanics, is that of a precursor to the FPS renaissance. Throughout the early second decade of the 21st century, there have been attempts at reboots to work the classical shooter back into the spotlight. So before there was Doom 2016 and Wolfenstein The New Order, there was Duke Nukem Forever, Rise of the Triad, and Serious Sam 3, and they all spelled failure, albeit in different fonts. But 2013 saw the first iteration of a reboot that was actually good. And so the character that marked the shift from flopping to rising was none other than the aptly named Wang in Shadow Warrior. This is a good game. It is also a flawed game, but it did what none other title could, and it subsequently affected the development of shooters in more ways than the most obvious. It had its sequel in 2016, and this was also a great product. It fixed the flaws of the old one, albeit it added some new ones. While its role is not as impactful as that of its predecessor, it is a much more enjoyable title, and while it paled in comparison to contemporary competition such as Doom, more or less to the point of being all but forgotten, Shadow Warrior 2 is a game so unique that in what it does, it is unmatched. No less for its quality than it is for the fact that no other title has had the same type of ambition, execution, or effect on the player. So it is safe to say that the reboot duology deserves to get some attention, and what better place than on a channel that also deserves more attention, woo. So with the recent renaissance in first-person shooters, I thought people might be interested in giving these two a try. So let's take a look at them and find out if their value is congruent with their positive reviews, and if either of the two is actually worth your time, provided your time is something of value. Before we begin, I would like to issue a disclaimer. You may notice that the footage of Shadow Warrior 2013 looks a bit low quality, and that is because I used different recording software for it and I might not have used it properly. Then again, you may not notice it because YouTube just might compress the whole video to a degree where it doesn't even matter. Either way, if the video quality happens to look like a jagged pixely mess that is an insult to your eyes, just pretend you're looking at the console version. And moving on to graphics, Shadow Warrior aims to impress with all the features that a lot of titles from the period tried to forward as next-gen and visually impressive. You will notice vibrant colors, god rays, lush vegetation, and a fair deal of particle effects. I'd also like to point out the cobblestone textures. It's not Mankind Divided, but that is a nice cobblestone. The visual fidelity and the presentation of both games is more or less top-notch for their respective generations, with Shadow Warrior 2 being a straight upgrade to its predecessor and a good-looking title that visually holds up even in 2020. And that's extra impressive because nobody holds up well in 2020. And while its predecessor is definitely lacking compared to modern standards, there is one thing Shadow Warrior 2013 does exceptionally well to the point of being virtually time-proof, and that is the stereoscopic 3D. Now that may not be too relevant today, however, Shadow Warrior 2013 does this effect extremely well, and only a handful of studios could pull it off, so the fact that a AA studio is among them is all the more impressive, and to that extent, I do believe that it is unique and timeless, and it does deserve due credit. Another thing worthy of note, and obviously a lot more relevant right now, are the physics and the gore. The 2013 game has somewhat destructible environments, which albeit not too impressive are a nice detail, but better yet, it has fully destructible enemies. The gore system, where you cut off or shoot off pieces of your enemies in such a spontaneous and location-contingent way, is one of those elements that really amplify the weight of the combat, of the player's actions having an impact on this world, most notably its inhabitants. It is a rare and very special kind of effect that even most modern titles don't have a tendency to do right. In fact, most modern titles don't do it at all. And it gets better still because Shadow Warrior 2 takes this effect and amplifies it. The violent ways of subduing your enemies have been improved and further glorified. And you know what? If a game can take one of the most painful PTSD-inducing, gruesome, and disease-prone acts a person can perform in real life and make it look like one of the best things you could be doing, it is either a great-looking gory game or an authentic dating sim. And in case you have a taste for property damage, you'll be happy to know that the physics and the destructibility have been overhauled as well. Some of the environments of Shadow Warrior 2 feature props and soft walls and the ability to tear them down. And while it is not on the level of Red Faction Guerrilla, it is a nice detail, and a fairly unique one at that. It is implemented well, and it is not an in-your-face mechanic, which makes it all the more impressive when you discover it. Another thing worth mentioning is the vegetation. In a game with a lot of natural settings, it matters that trees and undergrowth look well, and in Shadow Warrior 2, not only are they well designed and well lit, but they are also animated to flail in the wind, which gives them an additional sense of realism, and that instead of idly pretending to exist, they appear to be reacting to what is supposed to be happening in the environment. And it is these kinds of subtle effects that can help a virtual world look like a living, dynamic world. Which takes me to what is arguably the most poignant element of Shadow Warrior 2, the particle effects. The first one does a great job in this regard as well, but Shadow Warrior 2 takes particles to a whole new level. Be it overt effects such as the various explosions and the rain in the background, or subtler, barely noticeable details such as the sparks accompanying some of the bigger effects or fireflies flickering in the forest, you will find some combination to be iterated in one way or another pretty much at every instant. These are often underappreciated due to their minuscule size, but one should never overlook the immensity of their effect. They give the visuals a special sense of spontaneity, of things happening on their own, as nature actually does, and in that regard, Shadow Warrior 2 is one of the best looking games out there. And with all these things happening on screen, one is likely to wonder if normal hardware can be expected to keep up, and the answer is absolutely yes. Both titles are very well optimized for the respective mid-range systems contemporary to their releases. If I am to nitpick performance issues, one would be that Shadow Warrior 2 sometimes tanked performance when Nvidia's Shadowplay was active, but I don't think that will bother most people. Also, the 2013 game initially had some micro-stuttering, but that has been patched since. Not only do both games run very smoothly on the appropriate hardware, but provided you are willing to tinker with the settings, a 750 Ti should be enough to run both titles at playable frame rates, so they are both potentially something to look into even if you have dated hardware. There is really nothing to say about the performance past that. No crashes, no serious glitches, and perfectly reasonable requirements. And these two run very well, smooth and stable. However, not all is perfect. Both games have some visual flaws that give away their AA nature. For one, the animation quality is not very consistent. While some animations can be surprisingly well detailed at times, most animations tend to look either too stiff in Shadow Warrior 2 or too smooth for their own good in Shadow Warrior 2013. The SMG is especially detrimental in this regard because it doesn't even look like it has recoil. It rather looks like the protagonist is shaking it to pretend it has recoil. I've animated this short texture to demonstrate. Now if you look at the two animations, you will notice that they both have corresponding frames, but you also probably notice that one of them does a better job conveying the impact of the action, and that is because the keyframes are differently spaced out. In contrast, Shadow Warrior 2013 is more similar to the one on the left, with movements taking too long to execute and consequently feeling slow, floaty, and without any actual energy driving the motion. In addition to this, the cutscenes in Shadow Warrior 2 feature low-quality models, to the point that some characters can sometimes even look like free assets. And nobody should be forced to look at something this ugly outside the confines of a mirror. What's strange is that the fantasy enemies you fight for the most part are animated fairly well, so this remark applies almost exclusively to human characters, and especially to the people you encounter in cutscenes, which is obviously not a huge problem, but they do look bad enough to ruin any impact the cutscenes might have tried to have on the player. There is also the odd texture work, which deserves an especially eloquent, and environments can sometimes be too bright for their purpose, such as this instant where I am unable to see the loot because the ground literally outshines it. While it does look nice and shiny, it literally hinders the gameplay. There are definitely some questionable design choices and executions in this one, and you could nitpick a lot more if you so desire. With that aside, Shadow Warrior 2 looks good on the whole. Shadow Warrior 2013, on the other hand, looks visibly dated. The problem is not so much that 2013 was 7 years ago, although that is quite the existential problem, but rather that it is 2013 specifically. That was not an especially good period for graphics. The early 2010s had no actual distinct style, outside of trying to look real to life but lacking the technology to pull it off. So it was common to see detailed textures struggling with their own suboptimal resolutions, as well as the outright flatness of the surrounding textures, and you could expect to see needlessly shiny materials as compensation for the lack of actual lighting effects. That is Wang's head, by the way. Plenty of titles, Shadow Warrior included, couldn't really pull off the color palette either. They tried to be colorful to stand out from the grayness of the previous generation, but they ended up drifting between either too vibrant or too dull without being able to find the sweet spot. so the games looked oily, jagged, shiny, and out of place, leaving the player with the sense that there was something vaguely wrong with what they were looking at, which is a rare description that can cover graphics, strip clubs, and bodybuilder competitions all at the same time. And I couldn't really blame this on hardware alone. The 90s and the early 2000s were much more limited in that regard, but the contemporary developers found creative solutions to these kinds of problems, and that is how the emerging 3D of each era got its timeless charm. That is why some devs imitate the retro style today. It is defined by the solution and not the hurdle. Games ranging 2010 to 2014, for the most part, worked solely within the bounds instead of trying to go around them. So while I'm sure that my dislike for this style is mostly subjective, I don't think that 20 years from now, indie devs will be trying to imitate the style of, say, the Unreal Engine 3 the way that they're trying to mimic the Doom engine today. Now, this is not to say that Shadow Warrior 2013 looked bad, because for its time it looked amazing. It is competently made. It is just that it shows its age, and it is not an age marked by any visual triumph, so it lacks the kind of charm that could cover for the gap in technology. To clarify, you look at a 90s game and you think, hey, cool sprites. You look at an early to mid 2000s game and you think, wow, they're really pushing the atmosphere. But you look at a 2013 game and you think, hey, it's designed for 2 GB of video RAM. It is not necessarily bad, but I don't think the overall visual effect is good from a modern perspective. This part of the evaluation individual players will need to decide on their own. But I think that most of us would agree that where Shadow Warrior 2013 does well is exactly in those elements that set it apart from its era instead of those elements that categorize it as a part of its era. In regards to the gore, it still holds up. In regards to stereoscopic 3D, it is truly exceptional, and it is among the greats. But overall, it cannot hold its own as a visual experience. The art style is also hit or miss. While it gets the job done, it doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. It tries to bounce between ambient heavy horror, epic set pieces, and lighthearted violent mayhem a bit too loosely, so it never really establishes a consistent mood. I can never tell if the art direction took itself seriously or if it just put in all that detail for the sake of being colorful. It is not an issue early on, but it does get tiring after a while.
The only thing worse than a friend who tells bad jokes is a friend who tells bad jokes inside your head.
Did you just say we were friends? Best friends?
If I killed myself, would it kill you too? Please say yes.
Yes.
You're lying, aren't you?
Yes.
The same thing goes for the story. The characters are consistently annoying. Now, the original Wang was not especially likable either. He was a racist, violent, cannibalistic, and perverted old man. His rebooted iteration is expectedly toned down, but he is somehow even less likable.
You got Wang.
He comes off as nerdy and stifled while being no less morally depraved. Whereas the original reveled in how unapologetic he was, the new Wang flaunts this quality of an outcast hero by being almost too obsessed with appealing to audiences.
5,000 hitmen in this country, and I have to get the nerd? Where do you keep your porn?
This is my porn.
He tries to be a cool, edgy assassin and so-called killer while also being funny, nerdy, and awkward at the same time. Think Ash Williams, but he takes himself as seriously as a Terminator, and he is played by Jay Baruchel. It makes for serious dissonance, and it is especially noticeable as it is present in the player character. With that said though, apart from the character development, the writing of Shadow Warrior 2013 is actually fairly solid. If you look at it as part parody, there is some witty humor you could appreciate.
All the best heroes shake their heads.
Travis Bickle is a good guy now?
Close enough.
Listen, G.I.G., who says you're the hero here?
You did. You said every hero.
I know, but any yahoo can shave his head. This is unearned baldness.
What can I say? I live in hope.
And in addition to the occasional good joke, the main narrative is surprisingly well designed. It is told on 2 levels, the what and the why. The former is the plot, and it has Wang doing whatever needs to be done to advance the narrative. This is serviceable. It gets you to different settings and it is easy to follow. But the latter, that is, the why, has to do with the reasons for the plot being what it is, and it is unexpectedly good. Told through impressively painted cutscenes and thought out in the veins of an archetypal story of betrayal, it comes off as a genuine legend about deities of the Far East. While it is not something that will bring a tear to your eye, it is commendable in its quality, and I advise approaching it with an open mind, because there is definitely some quality art in it. Add to this a bit of hit or miss comedy, which when it hits has the quality of a good shower thought, and you get yourself a nicely written package. Which is not to say that it doesn't flout this tendency every now and then. So provided you can look past the moments it fails to deliver, be it in regards to characters, suspense, or humor, you're likely to find more substance in this one than what you might have expected from a former build-engine shooter.
But I will defend you to the last. This I promise you, sister.
And in this regard, Shadow Warrior 2 is the exact opposite. While it flaws the story, and it does wonders for the art style and the world building. The story is not necessarily bad, it is just devoid of those things that made the story of its predecessor good. Consequently, you can expect to see shallow characters and uninteresting dialogues that sometimes try to extend into emotional lies, but it doesn't really work out for them.
The rock doesn't choose the river, nor the river the rock, yet neither would exist without the other.
Tell him to lay off the cryptic wisdom and make my stupid potion already.
Kamiko says you're full of
The
shit.
humorous banter is hit or miss, and the conclusion is underwhelming. So it is inferior to its predecessor, but in quality it is no less than the original from the 1990s. And let's count our blessings, it could have been a lot worse. Never minding the story, however, which is not really important in these series, there are a lot of good things to be said about the art style. In addition to technical competence, Shadow Warrior 2 has a spot-on visual design for what it wants to present. It seems to have discovered the kind of style Shadow Warrior ought to go for. It takes Asian culture as portrayed in popular media as the foundation for its aesthetic, and it adds layers of fantasy to the point where what would otherwise be a stereotype now becomes but an influence. It does a great job of treating this simplified perception of the Far East with respect, but also tweaking it beyond a derivative imitation and into a visually consistent fantasy setting. And this balance does not stop in only one iteration of the Oriental aesthetic, it actually encompasses several. The main locations in the open world are a Japanese suburb with buildings you can enter, a fantasy forest replete with cave systems, a marshy area with temples, and a cyberpunk futuristic city. There is also the occasional lab and fantasy temple, as well as a creative hub with a cool dojo. The visual design is top tier, and it is even more impressive when you look back and take the time to appreciate just how expansive the design really is. Each of these areas has its own unique enemies, as well as representative weapons. The suburb has the Yakuza, the city has robots, the swamps have serpents, and the forest has predators. And if you look through my arsenal, you can see how the various weapons are canonically related to each area. You have the authentic, the traditional, and the sci-fi. The design of Shadow Warrior 2 ticks all the right boxes. It is detailed, it is expansive, and it is consistent. I don't know how many people would really pause to appreciate this, but if you value creativity in video games, Shadow Warrior 2 may be something to look into. So, in regards to the medium being a platform for art, both titles rank surprisingly high. The first game has some unique visual characteristics and an ambitious story, and the second one is visually impressive and offers a creatively designed world. Yes, they are a bit shy of perfect. The 2013 game is visibly dated and animations are often stiff and slow, and the 2016 title lacks in story and writing. But if you can look past that and you pay attention to the overall visual effect, the attention to detail and the art style, you will notice a degree of artistic interest and competence that makes up for any flaws you might encounter along the way. It's also worth mentioning that the 2013 game is unique in its 3D, and it definitely helps that both titles run very well. Okay, so, it took me a while to get to gameplay, but keep in mind I'm reviewing two games at the same time. Now, whereas I could compare art side by side, I can't really do that for the gameplay. Both games are so different that Shadow Warrior 2 may as well be considered a soft reboot of its 3 years older predecessor, which is the actual reboot of the original. Both share a core mechanic, but they take very different approaches to utilizing it. So I'll cover 2013 first, and then move on to its sequel. So if I asked you to think of a game that released when the genre was mostly associated with mediocre combat and online play, and it was so good that it restarted a series and absolutely obliterated the myth that single-player shooters were dead, all the while demonstrating how to implement classic fast-paced mechanics in a modern setting, what game would that be? I'll give you a hint. It separates exploration from combat, in that exploration is essential for upgrading your stats and gear, whereas combat happens in predetermined but naturally flowing arena-type sections. In addition to aim, major skills are movement and proper use of your arsenal. Also, melee attacks heal you. I know I'm leading you on here, but it's not Doom. It's Shadow Warrior, 3 years prior to 2016. Now, I'm not saying that Shadow Warrior was the first game to implement these mechanics, nor am I saying that id Software necessarily took inspiration from Flying Wild Hog. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that the first instance of a successful classical reboot in the context was a game that utilized all of these separate mechanics in one whole, and it made them complement each other, and the successful reboots that followed generally stuck to these principles. Shadow Warrior 2013, specifically with its ambition to be unique in the COD era, faced some particular challenges that often juxtapose the general taste with the intended design. There were also technical hurdles to consider. One was the necessity for big battles, contrasted with the difficulty of having placed enemies as opposed to spawning ones. Not only would it threaten performance, but it could also be a gateway for exploits, not to mention its impact on the pacing. Another was the impatience of the average player to go out of their way and explore. It is difficult to sell an action-packed product if 50% of it is solving a maze. Then again, you cannot have a classical shooter without secret hunting. Yet a third notion was that strafe jumping and bunny hopping are difficult to pull off in a setting that pertained to a sense of seriousness. It wouldn't feel right for a normal character to move like that, not to mention the limits of performance. And a closed level design would make health pickups and management weird. The player could have either a plethora or a deficit, resulting in either boredom or frustration respectively. But with a bit of creative design, the problems can be made to cancel each other out. They just need to find the right pattern, and that is exactly what Flying Wild Hog did. They needed secrets, but modern audience preferred simpler level design. Well, main objectives are straightforward, whereas secrets are generally unintuitive places within this straight path. This also serves a double purpose in that any path that has you going out of your way suggests the presence of a secret. To further incentivize the act, they have been repurposed from inventory to upgrades. Instead of an increase in something as blind as supplies, you gain the ability to unlock new mechanics. These also serve to add variety to the gameplay. Ammunition itself is plentiful in the main path. This is a shooter. The devs will not impinge on your right to shoot at things. And since health pickups are annoying to manage, both from design and gameplay perspective, the concept has been mostly eliminated, because now you can heal mid-battle with spells and melee attacks. The challenge is not about avoiding a total sum of damage, but rather about not taking too much damage at a time. He emphasized skill as movement. The less time you spend in one place, the more likely you are to survive. So you want to zip around your enemies, and you don't want to get cornered. To help you in this, you get a dash move. Not only is it a great mechanic, but it also complements and amplifies the sense of playing a ninja. Not that ninja. As for the big battles, well, you get big arenas with enemies that spawn as you take out their friends. So battles are crowded but never clogged, and they always take place where they have been intended to take place. And there's nothing weird about seeing portals when the setting clearly allows it. So the issues have been addressed thoroughly. Big battles can be easily executed, the skill ceiling demands speed and positioning, movement is rapid but not cartoony, and exploration is encouraged but also separate from the main objective. So far, this approach seems to have proven itself as the ideal foundation for these kinds of games, and I think that Shadow Warrior deserves due credit for pulling it off back in 2013, when the scene was yet to establish the returns of the classics. But the Shadow Warrior reboot is unique in another way as well, and that is the melee combat. You will notice almost as soon as you begin that this is not your average shooter. After a short introductory sequence, you find yourself in a hectic sword fight with katanas clashing like it's the Fedora license entrance exam. And the mechanic is actually rather deep. You get 2 attacks, a normal M1 attack and a charged power attack with the right mouse button. You can also throw shuriken to stun enemies. The direction of your swing is contingent on your movement. You can alter its parameters in the settings. This is almost Jedi Knight level of development. And while sword fights never really get to a point where that truly matters, it is nice to see how much attention has been devoted to the melee combat. And it doesn't end there. You will be using the sword throughout the entire game. It is beyond a doubt the best item in Wang's inventory. In addition to regular attacks, it has 3 special moves you can execute. The first is the Chi Strike, a powerful forward thrust which is one of your most damaging attacks. Eventually you get to unlock 2 more. One is the Circle of Iron, which is good for flexing your superior genes resistant to motion sickness. And the third is the Wing of Crane, which essentially turns the sword into a ranged projectile weapon. And it may well be the best power in the game. Because frankly, without the shockwave, it's just autism. Once you acquire it, sword fighting becomes a matter of dashing around until you find the optimal angle from which to strike as many baddies as you can. And would you look at that, I got most of my health back. I already touched upon this earlier. Once you unlock the skill, sword powers heal you. But instead of voluntary QTEs that give you a whole 5 hit points, the amount of healing done here depends on how well you've utilized it. It can be minuscule and it can be a lot, and it will often save your life. Once you get to healing power, you're basically a MOBA character with a lifesteal build. Combat becomes centered around optimal use of sword skills, as if the real-time gore was not incentive enough. By the way, you can also force push enemies and make them levitate. This focus on sword fighting makes the combat unique. While the magic is admittedly not as impressive, playing Wang as a sword fighter monk is arguably the highlight of the Shadow Warrior reboot, which is not to say that hacking replaces the shooting. The gunplay is actually well thought out. Not only are firearms viable, they can often be the preferred tool for the job. Just about every encounter has you switching between the sword and one of 6 permanent ranged weapons. The sword has a slight advantage for its novelty, but the ratio is still about 50-50. The guns are diverse and each has its use. The starting pistol is a mid-range headshot weapon. It gives high rewards, and if you're accurate enough, it can be very useful early on, and it stays relevant into late game. The SMG is deceptively powerful. It looks like a low-impact, low-accuracy throwaway type, but its damage per second is not to be underestimated. It is good for clearing mobs as well as melting away larger opponents, including some bosses. You get a crossbow, which is a chargeable railgun. The shotgun, while admittedly not as impressive as the riot gun from the original, still has up to 4 barrels and it does exactly what you think it does. It makes groovy things happen. Now, there are a few things to note about flamethrowers. They're a unique weapon type. Their presentation relies on particle effects and their method is neither directly hit-scan nor projectile based. They're a unique weapon in any setting. For this reason, not many games dare to feature them, and even less actually succeed in it. The execution is difficult and the risks are high. It is the weapon design equivalent of asking out a girl. No matter the outcome, your courage is commendable. Now in Shadow Warrior, it is a bit underpowered for a weapon you acquire in the late game. It has the typical flamethrower problem of not dealing nearly enough damage for a close-range weapon that puts the player in harm's way and also hurts him. With that said, it still has its moments, and it looks good, so I'd still give it a thumbs up. The moral is that if you're a game dev and you want to earn extra respect, a functioning flamethrower can carry you a long way. The last weapon is a rocket launcher. It's nothing to write home about, not compared to the one in the original, but it's a good weapon nonetheless, and any self-respecting shooter needs some form of a rocket launcher. Take Nose Machine Games. All of these weapons can be upgraded, and most get a secondary fire option. And in addition to these, you can also use demon hearts as grenades, and when you kill these big guys, you can use their heads as lasers. That is a total of 9 weapons, each corresponding to a specific category of the shooter standard, plus a few additional firing modes and skills. The weapon system is impressively well designed.
Shooting demons is like shooting people, but without
Now I have bad news. So far I've covered what's good with the game, but it's time to move on to the other side. There are quite a few things to say. Maybe there's a secret downstream. I think I'll go and explore. I'll just jump off this railing and... No. I'll begin with a minor flaw. Fall damage. Small drops and even drops onto soft surfaces are lethal to low Wang. You can die falling from distances you have previously survived in cutscenes. Fall damage, especially one so strict, has no place in a game like this. If you don't want the player to go a certain way that badly, put a virtual wall, and do not prevent the player from taking permissible shortcuts. It may not sound like a big issue, but unintuitive death traps are not good game design, especially if you want to encourage exploration. Since the game allows me to walk this way, I suppose swimming is possible. Maybe if... Even when you do learn to tolerate it, since the dash button is the same as the sprint button, you might end up jumping by accident. This is perhaps the only shooter where running downstairs is a lethal endeavor. It's like a PSA for boomers. It is not a huge flaw, but it is annoying, especially if your last game was something like Doom or even Borderlands. Perhaps a bigger problem is the aiming. I actually had trouble using the mouse in this one, and I generally do not struggle lining up shots. And it's not the controls are fine. It is probably more to do with hitboxes. Most enemies seem to have been designed with the purpose of being difficult to hit. They move erratically, and the criteria for what counts as a landed shot seems a bit too strict for a game of this type, with near misses being counted as total misses and hits not always showing feedback. Doom did not have this problem because Doom's enemies were designed to be shot. They move predictably and their hitboxes are big enough to ensure some leniency. Now, finesse in aiming is not necessarily a bad thing. Raising the skill ceiling is generally a good decision, but the quantity of this particular skill does not seem to bode well with games of this type. What in theory seems like a balance between speed and finesse is actually a constant struggle between high and low sensitivity, especially if you're using a small mousepad, so trying to go for precision shots feels often unreliable. This could be a subjective experience, but it did not have this problem in either of the Doom titles or any shooter I've played up to this one. The level design can also be off-putting at times. Not only are there many dark and uninteresting corridors, but these same places will often have you backtracking. There is a section where in order to progress through the level, you need to trigger a cutscene, even though the game does not let you know that this is the case, so you might find yourself trying to solve a puzzle where it never existed. I guess I could also nitpick the ranking system, which determines how much karma you get at the end of each battle, and the fact that it is so arbitrary nobody seems to know what actually determines your score. But the major transgressor in Shadow Warrior 2013, and the one that truly hurts the game, is that after a while it begins to bore the player. Not only is it repetitive, but it also has some questionable enemy designs and bad encounters. Just about every battle starts and ends the same way. This doesn't look like something that should get boring, but it does. The layout of the arenas typically remains the same, a flat plane of variable size with spawning enemies. Whereas Serious Sam had huge arenas and Doom 2016 had verticality, Shadow Warrior 2013 has neither the quantity of the former nor the level design of the latter. It simply features different enemy combinations in arenas with little to no variation on the layout. And even that could be tolerable, but the more you progress through the game, the more you encounter tanky enemies with needlessly large health pools. This takes the fun out of the action, so combat becomes repetitive and chore-like. Now, when you do get around to obliterating mobs of fodder demons, it remains generally fun. There are not many pleasures in life like the causing fun necessary bleeding. 9 out of 10 dentists agree. But there are only so many times you can repeat the same action without it beginning to go stale on you. It doesn't necessarily become boring, but it does make the entertainment factor subside just enough for the game's flaws, be it minor or major, to start making themselves all the more noticeable. And it can be especially frustrating once you realize that you've been doing the same thing over and over again, and you're obliged to keep repeating it until the end of the game, which is kind of the essence of the word chore and the antithesis of fun. That's not something you want to experience in a 15-hour game, especially not before you're 2/3 through. Just as the game begins to feel too repetitive for its own good, it also decides to introduce the player to a new enemy type, Snotballs. These are the kamikaze of the Shadow Warrior reboot, and their only purpose is to be a nuisance. They either sit in ambush or they rush the player like a genetic mix between a cheetah and a middle finger. If they close the distance, they explode. If you shoot them, they explode. They do not look interesting, nor are they fun to kill. They seem to have been built around inconveniencing the player, around making the player pause to heal and to check corners like it's some kind of a tactical shooter.
Not this shit again.
They were only a minor hindrance when they first appeared, but cumulatively they worked their way into becoming my second least favorite sight in the game. And that is because the number one place we go to the Berserker. If the Snotballs were designed to annoy the player, these mirror-licking betards were designed to bridge the gap between annoyance and frustration. The first one you encounter is a mini-boss, and he is not too bad in isolation. But in the last quarter of the game, they become a common enemy, and they are so bad that even the wiki complains about them. Now, in theory, the mechanic is simple. They are invulnerable from the front, and you can only hurt them by shooting them in the back. Except that they are virtually invulnerable from the back too. Just look. Then imagine fighting two of them in a closed dark area with breakable walls which conceal their movements. It sounds cool on paper until you've experienced the execution. You know what'd be a good joke? If I could make it look like there's an arena that features Snotballs and Berserkers at the same time. You know what else is a joke? Life.
Bruh.
So that was Shadow Warrior 2013, the good and the bad. There is no doubt there are better games out there. This one is obviously dated. Its repetitiveness tends to take the fun out of the good, and it amplifies the frustration experienced with the not so good. But there is also no doubt that this is a good game in spite of that. When it came out, it blew people away. It was unique in many aspects. It focused on single player in the era of the online shooter. It successfully brought back a classic series, and it pioneered the successful use of the formula which other titles would later perfect. The interplay between arcade and grounded, and the balance between secret hunting and combat. Upgrades in gunplay design make the gameplay relatively deep for a game of this type. And concerning the sword fighting, it still remains an extremely unique shooter. Other than its sequel in the old Jedi Knight series, it has no competition in that regard. And it was obviously successful enough to get a sequel. So the question that follows is whether the sequel from 2016 is any good. Does it build on the original's strong sides? Does it correct its mistakes? And does it introduce anything new? And the answer is going to be a triple yes, one for each question. Not only does it come off as a straight upgrade in just about every regard, but it also handles the game world so differently that it may as well be a soft reboot of the 2013 reboot. I've already mentioned that it is visually and technically superior, but it executes the large majority of things better in the gameplay as well. Whereas repetitiveness was the blight of its predecessor, Shadow Warrior 2 has no issues with repetition in the first playthrough. Part of this is due to the design itself. Instead of bland corridors, it puts you into an open world with aesthetically pleasing, varied, and creatively executed themes. And whereas main locations remain the same, the space between them is randomized, so there is a slight procedural generation to the levels and enemy placement, which ensures that you don't take the same road twice, even when revisiting settings. The roster of enemies you can fight has also been altered, with a higher number of human enemies and enemies with lower health pools in general, meaning that there is more focus on that hack-and-slash semi-horde shooter element that made the 2013 game so fun. Your sword feels sharp and your firearms feel powerful because the world is a lot more responsive to your potential for destruction, whereas tougher enemies have been mostly relegated to either boss and mini-boss battles or higher levels. Now with that said, tougher enemies can seem a bit extra bullet spongy in earlier levels, and that's not ideal. But as soon as you begin to build your character and get better equipment, your damage potential will also increase, so we'll go through a process of change in how quickly you're able to take them down. Eventually, medium enemies will join the list of fodder-type weak enemies, and the tougher enemies will feel like medium enemies. So their initial tankiness kind of plays to the game's strength because there is a sense of progression here. It is not just about advancing through the game, it is also about advancing as a character or a character build.
The 10 crack commandments. Number 4, I know you've heard this before, never get high on your own supply, huh?
And those are the 3 ways in which Shadow Warrior 2 ensures that repetition does not become a problem. You get a much more appealing game world, more varied enemies that complement the fast-paced dynamic nature of the mechanics, and light RPG elements with stats and loot to ensure things always change up. Now this brings me to my next point, which is one of the first noticeable changes, and that is the arsenal and the way you use it. One aspect that comes as a straight upgrade is the sheer number of weapons the game has to offer. If I say the number has been quadrupled, I'd be selling it short. And the weapon variety is actually good. Not only are there several categories of weapons, but their behaviors vary within these categories. And while you have access to an abundance of firearms and launchers, you also get unique projectile weapons such as bows and nail guns and gauntlets and harpoons. Just in case you want something in addition to your pump-action musket shotgun with an axe attachment that fires electric rounds. There are weapons here to fit every playstyle, provided your playstyle is in any way similar to an action hero's take on mass murder. So instead of using a preset arsenal that the game wants you to use, you get to make your own, and you get to build it around whatever approach you prefer. Shadow Warrior 2 also emphasizes elemental damage, which looks like yet another Borderlands influence. But here the twist is that elemental damage is not usually tied to the weapon, but to the lootable weapon mods, and these can determine many stats, including elemental damage and stats related to it, such as effect, conversion, and vulnerability, but they also affect things like base damage and critical chance. And if you have the right perks, weapon mods can also let you dual wield a certain gun or deploy it as a mobile turret. These are a creative approach, and they account for even more freedom on the player's part, as they allow the player to choose the mods they want for the weapons they prefer. Unfortunately, they are also the cause for the game's 2 major setbacks. The first has to do with managing the looted mods. Look how many there are. Each battle results in several drops, and most of them are useless. Inventory management behaves like a creeping chore. You either check them after each encounter, which interferes with the otherwise fluent gameplay, or you hoard them to sell later, which results in a huge list you'll have to eventually clean up. And considering that you always get new equipment, there is no point where you actually have all your mods settled. They are more or less a constant nuisance. Perhaps a way around it would be to sell all of them and only use mods you purchase, but that is cutting back on some potentially great upgrades. Eventually you get to craft your own, but instead of diminishing the management element, it only adds to it. This is a serious problem. Excessive inventory management can be a turn-off in loot-oriented role-playing games, let alone a fast-paced shooter. The other issues stemming from elemental damage are enemy resistances and immunities. The first facet of this problem is that they nullify some of the builds. On higher difficulties, especially as you advance through levels, most enemies will have power resistances, which makes otherwise fun skills like the force push and spikes obsolete. What begins as a crowd control gimmick ends up being completely useless. And while I can kind of see why this decision might have been made, I don't think the best solution to possible exploits was to entirely eliminate a skill tree. But a bigger problem are the resistances and immunities to elemental damage and the fact that they are not fixed. Now in Borderlands, the system was fairly intuitive. Flesh equals fire, metal equals corrosive, and shield equals electric. And in case you're not sure, you can tell by the color of the health bars. But in Shadow Warrior 2 it is randomized. 2 enemies of the same type, often in the same battle, can have different resistances and vulnerabilities. And the way to tell what they are is not to look at their health bars, but to literally read their stats. Oh golly. And it's not like the vulnerabilities show in a selected spot on the list. They can appear anywhere, so you more or less need to read the whole box, nor are they presented in a way that stands out. To the game's defense, there is some attempt at color coding in some of the enemies, but it is not very useful. What's worse is that the higher the difficulty setting, the more immunities and resistances your opponents have. Consequently, there is even more text on screen. It doesn't look good, it imposes on the otherwise great visuals, and it's a blatant transgression of the show don't tell principle. This is like a combination between a speed reading championship and a what were you thinking nomination. Instead of enjoying the flow of combat and focusing on dodging and aiming, battles are often interrupted by an exercise in keeping track of instant bulletins. It is not too bad once you get used to it, but first of all, not too bad is still bad, and second, reading charts is not a mechanic you should be getting used to in a fast-paced shooter. So I do hope that they improve this in Shadow Warrior 3. And you know what? I've just covered all of the major issues the game has. And if it can have issues as serious as these and still offer one of the most entertaining experiences I've had in a recent shooter, it must be an otherwise amazing product. The thing is, once you take those two away, the rest of Shadow Warrior 2 is stellar, so we're back on the good track. The reason that Shadow Warrior 2 can carry itself, irrespective of the implicit course and statistics, are primarily its mechanics, specifically the movement and the melee combat. Whereas it does accomplish great things with the visuals in the enemy roster and the weapons arsenal, what makes it stand out from the rest, and in such a unique and satisfying way, are the ways it handles movement and its focus on melee combat. Concerning its ingenuity in regards to movement mechanics, the best way to describe it would be in terms of taking already established mechanics for the genre to the next level. What I mean by that is the logical conclusion to dash and double jump, namely double dash jump, or any combination of up to 4 possible integrated movements. The result is an incredibly fast mega dash that feels perfectly rapid and perfectly controllable at the same time. And it is probably the fastest and most fun movement system I've seen in an FPS other than the strafe jumping in Dusk. And the game doesn't even boast with it. Most games would shove a mechanic like this in your face, but here it's something you mostly discover on your own. And it is a great discovery. It is viable for getting places quickly as well as dodging attacks and repositioning. It finds many uses in and out of combat, and it has no cooldown, which means you'll be doing it more or less anytime you're moving. Just be careful because it's not exactly easy in attendance. I'm serious. The melee combat has the same foundation as the 2013 game, but the animations and the controls have been somewhat tweaked to account for a smoother experience. Moreover, instead of being limited to only one sword, you now get an abundance of melee weapons that look and behave differently, be it in raw damage, DPS, or special effects, and ranging from swords, oversized shurikens, spiked bats, chainswords, and more. And with the improved movement, the melee combat becomes all the better. In fact, it is possible to play through the whole game using melee weapons alone. Usage. As with every melee weapon, the Nabitsurikage is useful against everything that lives. With this, Shadow Warrior 2 achieves 2 things. First, it may actually have the best melee system in any FPS, with the possible exception of Jedi Outcast from 2002. It has a rare mechanic, and it does it very well. And second, and more importantly, Shadow Warrior 2 is likely the only game in existence that is a first-person hack-and-slash shooter. That is a unique subgenre that applies to this game alone. It is an entire category used to describe only one representative. In that regard, it is so unique that it is essentially and quite literally one and only. There is nothing like it out there, and even if there was, the near-perfect implementation of Shadow Warrior's mechanics has raised the standards so high that anything that tries to follow in its steps would have to be a masterpiece in its own right in order to be comparable. I could recommend Shadow Warrior 2 on these grounds alone. By the way, there is no fall damage, respawns are seamless, and aiming is much easier. So Shadow Warrior 2 is essentially these aforementioned mechanics laid out across a set of main missions, side missions, and open levels that complement the hub in a kind of an open world setting. If by open you mean free to explore, and by world you mean the place where you go exclusively to wage war. So the American definition. In that sense, I suppose it is something like Wolfenstein 2009 in that it has all the marks of an open world, but other than loot, secrets, and killing, there is no point to exploring. There is no lore or miscellaneous quests, in which sense the open world is kind of an over-elaborate hub. And that's fine for a game like this. It works here just as well as it did with Wolfenstein, even though the approach is obviously different. I spent about 30 hours on the first playthrough. How Long to Beat mentions a much shorter length, but I think the reason for this might be that How Long to Beat does not actually take the DLCs into account. These serve as bounty quests that both help in the grind and increase the length of the game by giving you an excuse to kill even more things. They're all free, by the way. So all in all, you do get a good, fun, and sufficiently long package. That could be the setup for a joke, but I'll let you imagine it instead. The game tries to encourage multiple playthroughs, and it has several New Game Plus modes, and these could further lengthen the experience. With that said though, I didn't actually enjoy the New Game Plus because its method seems to be to artificially reset the value of your loot by nearly doubling the health pools of your enemies. It also seems to impose a much more narrow playstyle. The gameplay we're looking at right now is part of that, and unless it looks like something you'd enjoy, I advise playing on Who Wants Wang. The difficulty settings seem to be well planned as well, with detailed information on what each one does, so you can better make your decision. My only remark is that it doesn't make fun of people who play on easy. This difficulty level is for people who don't feel like they need to prove anything to themselves or anyone else. Playing Shadow Warrior 2 in easy is perfectly fine, but at the end of exhausting day, all you need is to feel like a goddamn superhero. Let me see if I can fix that for you. Much better. So, the gameplay is mostly about large, hectic battles. You can probably notice in the movement and combat mechanics as well that this is a game that aims for the chaotic and the unpredictable, and that is exactly how battles play out. There is of course a quiet hub and RPG elements to break up the tension, but for the most part you will be knee-deep in intellectual discussion concerning the virtues of pacifism and dashing from one enemy to the other as you make well-argumented, credible claims to support your statements. These happen expectedly in missions, with planned-out scenarios and level design, and they're all in good fun. And these hectic aspects of the battles, the enemy count and the difficulty, are further emphasized in the so-called trial maps, which are not missions but challenges, and they are as enjoyable as the main game with steroids. I mean, it's a hack-and-slash horde shooter with slick movement and tons of enemies, of course it will be enjoyable. But it gets better still, because the interplay between the open world and the movement system and the aggressive AI converges into a very interesting phenomenon. You see, as you dash, double jump, dash through the open world of Shadow Warrior 2, you will likely aggro a lot of enemies, and as they chase you and as you run away at the speed of youth in the mid-20s, you will trigger even more. Now it could occasionally turn around and chip away bits of their health, and that is fun, but eventually you will come to a place where you need to make your stand. And it is these encounters that make the game more than the sum of its parts by adding yet another exceptionally unique trait, and one that is exceptionally fun at that. These are big battles, and the factors that determine their scope are contingent and randomized occurrences, that is, the enemies you've encountered and the place where you decide to stand and fight. None of this is scripted or predetermined. It is a spontaneous event that plays like an arena shooter, all the while being perfectly randomized. And it is a great achievement to have these almost serious Sam-like encounters happening entirely on their own and limited by pretty much nothing. So, Shadow Warrior 2 gets both aspects of level design right. On the one hand, you have the planned out, crafted settings that put you in an arena designed for fighting, much like most shooters that follow this method, but it also offers the random variable determined spontaneous encounters that procedurally generated titles tend to go for. And it gets both just right. The former are great, and the latter are what makes this game truly stand out among the rest. And this adds to the game's credit both as a fun, suspenseful kind of spontaneous mayhem, but also in an unexpectedly congruent ludonarrative harmony. In which sense, this is probably yet a third mark of Shadow Warrior 2 as a one-of-a-kind game, in that it is likely the only modern classic shooter that has its own functioning biospheres in how organic of a world it depicts. At this point, it is probably no mystery that this is a game I recommend. Unless you're severely turned off by inventory management or you simply don't like shooters, there really is no reason not to play it. It is incredibly fun, it is incredibly unique, and it can last you a good while, be it as a serious playthrough or as a time killer later on. Now, I'm not sure if I would say the same about its predecessor from 2013. While it was a good game for its time and some parts of it still hold up, better games have been released since, most notably Shadow Warrior 2, so it has been, in a way, replaced by its successors. To that extent, I'd say there are much better ways to spend your 15 hours, even if you're looking specifically for a modern iteration of a classic shooter. With that said, if it sounds like fun and you think you could tolerate its flaws, it might be a good idea as a primer for the upcoming third game, provided you can get a good deal. Now, let me say it again, Shadow Warrior 2 is not only a positive review but also a recommendation. That means that it is my opinion that you should play this even if it is your first time hearing about it. In fact, the initial purpose for this video was to review Shadow Warrior 2 and to recommend it as an underrated gem, but I also wanted to compare it to its predecessor, and then I decided that the reboot project deserves full attention. And now that I look at the first draft, I think I made the right call. If you made it this long into the video, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and that goes double for those of you who have subscribed in the meantime. I'd like to say that you're all amazing, but amazing pales in comparison to groovy, which you most certainly are. And that is the end of the review. I'll say a few things about the channel and let the battle play out. I know in my Fallout 4 video I said I'd try making some shorter videos and uploading more frequently. And in a way I did. These last few months I've made and uploaded 4 videos, it's just that they were not for my channel. I'm serious. But now I'm back, so for the third time in a row I vow to increase my output for this channel. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you enjoyed Shadow Warrior 2, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll be seeing you soon, and take care, everybody. Peace.
The ugliest thing I killed today.